Hello, everybody, and welcome to our special topics in Mormon genre panel for the afternoon session. This is going to focus on late 19th and early 20th centuries. But before I introduce everybody, I'm going to wait a little bit to let viewers join the stream. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. So as I mentioned, this panel is we're doing some special topics in Mormon genre, specifically focused on works from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. First, we'll hear from Makoto Hunter, then Stephen Carter, and then Amanda Hendrix-Komoto. If you have questions, please put them in the YouTube chat and I will bring them up during our Q&A section at the end. I also, if you have some comments for all the panelists or individual panelists, go ahead and put them in the chat and I will carry them over into our Zoom chat as well. After this panel is over, there'll be a little bit of a break, and then at 2:30 p.m. Mountain Time, we'll have a special conversation with Stephen Carter, who'll be talking about his writing career in Mormon literature with Angela Hellstrom. But first, let's do this panel. So I'm throwing it over to you, Makoto. Go ahead.
Thanks very much. And slides visible and everything? While en route by wagon from southern Utah to northeastern Arizona in May 1882, Latter-day Saint diarist Ida Hunt Udall noted how she passed a day by reading The Rector of St. Mark's, a novel by Mary Jane Holmes, which she brought with her on the trail. The Rector of St. Mark's was a popular romance, telling the gripping drama of how titular minister Arthur Layton is eventually torn between marrying two different women, Lucy Harcourt, to whom he bears a responsibility, and Anna Ruthven, whom he truly loves. Eventually, circumstances are such that Arthur marries Anna, Lucy finds another love, and all live happily ever after. That Udall read this novel to pass the time on a long journey is not unusual. Holmes was one of the most popular writers of her day. Yet one cannot help but wonder what Udall made of the love triangle. She was, after all, on her way home from the St. George Temple, where she had just a month earlier been sealed as a second wife to David King Udall, becoming a co-wife to his first spouse, Ella Stewart, both of whom she had met the past winter. In 1881, Holmes's fictional trio ultimately resolved into monogamous marriages, but the Udalls walked a quite different path. Romance as a genre has a distinctive sense of relatability. Its key elements, intimate encounters and loving affections, are nearly universal, or are often believed to be. All our bodies are born as the product of intimate encounters, albeit whether they were loving or not, and many people experience or desire the phenomenon of being in love. As Catherine M. Roach posits in her study of popular romance, through the 19th and 20th centuries, the romantic love match came to dominate as the ideal for marriage in Western culture and as the answer to how to define and live the good life, to the point that romance may well be the prime cultural narrative of the modern Western world. Insofar as the romantic love match came to dominate as the ideal for marriage, what then are the implications for romance written by Latter-day Saints in a time of transition, the last years of publicly promoting their own polygamous ideal for marriage, and their first years of rapprochement with monogamous America? By traditionally ending in heterosexual monogamy, the romance genre was embedded in wider discourses about sexuality, personhood, and modernity, in turn making it a useful tool for reflecting on marriage and society. I aim to probe as case studies two different romance plots written by Latter-day Saints, tracing the profound contrast between a halting attempt to revise the romance to suit polygamy versus a traditional deployment of the monogamous romance, which imagined Mormon reintegration with the United States by rewriting Latter-day Saint history. In doing so, I add to the complex portrait of Mormonism in transition, shifting from the typical terrain of bureaucratic developments and homiletic changes to social aspirations and the internalization of such changes. Before diving into the specific cases, it's useful to introduce romance as a genre and the scholarship my paper takes cues from. By serendipity, this year marks the 20th anniversary of Pamela Regis's A Natural History of the Romance novel, the monograph which inaugurated the current shape of literary romance studies. Fittingly, That same year, Ariantum published a special issue about genre romance in Mormon literature. In a moment of overlapping interests, both Regis and the Ariantum authors defended the romance against earlier scholarship and criticism, which considered the genre a formulaic anti-feminist manipulation. Regis and Ariantum contributors Annette Lyon, Barbara Hume, Valerie Holiday, and Josie Kilpack articulated how romance is as capable of substance and meaning as any genre, and in practice often, for its predominantly women authors and readers, is a means to assert female agency, explore the depth of relational human existence, and feel solidarity with fictional characters and real-life authors. Regis and the Ariantum author edition mostly focused their interests on romance novels as the specific form of the genre, but the conventions of romance cross into short stories and even personal diaries. For a broader understanding of romance, I take cues from Catherine Roach's Happily Ever After, which contemplates the broad romance narrative as it appears in diverse cultural products. Both Regis and Roach offer definitions, but for present purposes and want of time, the key element of a romance to keep in mind is its traditional conclusion in heterosexual marriage. Let's now return to Ida Hunt Udall's 1880s diary, where she reworked the romance to fit Latter-day Saint polygamy and her alienation from the United States. After that, I turned to Phoebe Campbell's 1901 Morris Gray's Savior, where she rewrote the Latter-day Saint past to comport with the standard romance and meet American norms. Ida Hunt Udall, of course, was a historical person rather than a fictional character, but stories do not tell only fabrications. As contemporaneous author Frances Hodgson Burnett wrote only a few years after Udall's marriage, everything is a story, everything in this world. You are a story, I am a story. In an academic vein, and speaking from deep indigenous traditions and native studies, Thomas King summarized in 2003 that the truth about stories is that that's all that we are. Romance is a prime cultural narrative, and in Ida Hunt's diary, it also became a mechanism by which to narrate her personal life. In her 2002 literary study of Ida Hunt Udall's diary, Genevieve J. Long observes that a few days before Ida's wedding to David King and Ella Stewart, her usually terse writing, focused on recording the day's events, gave way to a reflective meditation, mentioning a feeling of dread and fear at my heart impossible to describe, end quote, with an accompanying stylistic shift from concise to dramatic language, resembling contemporaneous popular fiction. Long identifies this abruptly different style specifically with Holmes as the rector of St. Mark's, the romance novel Ida brought with her for the trip. Long points out how even in this personal outpouring, Ida noticeably did not directly name either David or Ella in the day's diary entry. Instead, she only mentioned one dearest on earth to me, implicitly David, and another who was passing through sorrow, seemingly on my account, though I was powerless to help it, Ella. Long argues that this refraining from names is borrowed from a scene of emotional climax in The Rector of St. Mark's, wherein Arthur Layton prays for Lucy and for Anna, but Anna's, quote, name he could not speak, that other one, he called her, and his heart kept swelling in his throat and preventing his utterance, so that the words he would say never reached his lips, end quote. As Long explains, Ida Udall dealt with the trip's emotional ups and downs by borrowing the language of fiction and figuring herself as a heroine in one of the novels she read. To describe the indescribable, Ida borrowed Holmes's words and plot, writing her life story as an imminent plural wife into the genre of romance, and, according to Long, casting herself and Ella as unfortunate rivals. Indeed, this sentimental style reappears in the more positively inflected diary entry written for her wedding night. Long concludes, ending with a wedding and the appearance of Happily Ever After, this is a plot that might, with a little adjustment, have come straight from one of Udall's own favorite novels. Long's observation that Udall used genre conventions to navigate her feelings and experiences is insightful. However, I am interested in lingering more on what Long limits to a momentary qualification, that this is a plot that might, with a little adjustment, have come straight from one of Udall's favorite novels. That little adjustment is not so little at all. No mainstream romance novel available to Ida Udall would have ended in polygamy. This is not merely a detail. Close examination suggests that if Udall borrowed romance conventions from the rector of St. Mark's, she also carefully revised them, rewriting the romance to incorporate polygamy. Long suggests that in borrowing the language of genre romance from the rector of St. Mark's, Ida portrayed herself as a rival to Ella. This would imply mapping Ida and Ella onto, say, Anna Ruthven and Lucy Harcourt, while David played the role of Arthur, torn between affection and responsibility. However, recall Long's identification of Ida's another with the fictional Arthur's that other, Anna Ruthven. If Ida did borrow the choice to leave David and Ella nameless from the rector of St. Mark's, then she did not place herself in the shoes of either Anna or Lucy competing over David as Arthur. Instead, she cast both David and Ella, both unnamed in the diary entry, as the Annas to her Arthur, as she took his place in being unable to quite name his love or loves. And even though Ida reserved the loftier ellipsis for David, the one dearest to me, her concern that Ella might sorrow paralleled Arthur's concern in his prayer for Anna. Recall also that by the end of the novel, happily ever after is Arthur marrying Anna. Ida Udall did not then make herself Ella's rival. Instead, Ida's rewrite of the rector of St. Mark's into the story of her life featured both David and Ella in the role of her marital endgame, so to speak. Far from being straight from one of Udall's own favorite novels, the plot Ida implied for her life was a dramatic departure. Recognizing this helps make more sense out of the reappearance of romantic genre language in the wedding night diary entry. Ida wrote this as the happy ending to her diary's romance plot. But instead of concluding with heterosexual monogamy, her ending features polygamy. The sorrow that concerned Ida was replaced with Ella visiting Ida's room, where they talked long and earnestly of our hopes and desires for the future. There is the ever after, both feeling much happier for the same. And there is the happily. Both indicated not with David, who slept in a separate room that night, but with Ella, Ida's co-wife. And on top of these departures from genre conventions and marital norms, Ida added her sense of alienation from the United States as she periodized her marriage with an implicit reference to the 1882 Edmunds Anti-Polygamy Act, signed into law only 2 months earlier. Marriage under ordinary circumstances, she wrote, quote, is a grave and important step, but entering into plural marriage in these perilous times is doubly so, end quote. Rather than write herself into the American romance, Ida reworked the tropes to make a polygamous Latter-day Saint romance. Of course, while Ida's diary for the spring of 1882 might read like a romance, her life itself was just that, real life. The happily ever after she penned gave way to everyday pleasures, but also everyday difficulties and tensions. And eventually, the implicit periodization of perilous times turned into the anti-polygamy raid, thousands of prosecutions, men and women in hiding, and the end of plural marriage as a practice of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, albeit more gradually and messily than Wilfred Woodruff's 1890 manifesto would imply. Excellent scholarship has examined this transformation's devotional, societal, and political dimensions. Through the case of Phoebe Campbell's 1901 short story Morris Gray's Savior, I wish to gesture toward examining how some Latter-day Saints articulated this change personally. Campbell's Morris Gray's Savior appears in the January 15, 1901 edition of The White and Blue, a student magazine at Brigham Young University in Provo. It tells a genuinely sweet, albeit somewhat contrived story about a young Latter-day Saint woman named Ruth Ashton, who, due to the untimely deaths of her father and mother in Utah, moves back east to live with the family of a non-Mormon friend of her father, who had promised, despite trepidations about Mormons, to take care of Ruth if something happened to her parents, which did. Ruth moves in with the non-Mormon Gray family and ends up defying their expectations of meeting a rural bumpkin, as she is instead cultured and graceful. Ruth and Morris Gray soon are smitten with each other, and by winning over Morris's mother and sister to the restored gospel, Ruth clears the way for her and Morris to marry, and they all move with her back to Utah in what one imagines for Campbell was a very happily ever after. Campbell's romance is more traditional than Udall's, but more is at play here than a commitment to convention. Juxtaposing Morris Gray's Savior with Udall's diary helps make clear where Campbell's preoccupations lay. Where Udall's reworked romance noted her alienation from America and incorporated her polygamous present, Campbell rewrote the Latter-day Saint story to fit the American romance genre, asserting Latter-day Saint compatibility with the United States and obfuscating the Church's polygamous past. Both Udall and Campbell noted distance between Latter-day Saints and non-Mormon Americans, but where Udall described this in the key of danger, perilous times, Campbell cast it as misunderstanding, a failure to recognize Latter-day Saints as normatively American. The Gray family's expectations for Ruth are tellingly focused on racially charged attributes of body and manner. Morris's sister is sure Ruth will be gawky and uncultured. When Ruth turns out to instead be a beautiful girl with wavy brown hair and a somewhat pale face, the whole family is stunned by her appearance. Ruth Ashton, the Mormon girl, Morris wonders, is it possible? As Spencer Fluman put in his 2012 A Peculiar People, when 19th century anti-Mormon polemics tied their view of Mormonism to other stereotypes against supposedly barbaric peoples, the faith tradition came to inhabit the vexed space between white and non-white in American minds. The White and Blue that later that very year reported how President Crosby told us what a curiosity a Mormon is in Montana. The Mormon people, he said, are looked upon as a peculiar savage race. Even some of the enlightened boys and girls of other communities believe us to have horns. By having the Greys expect someone gawky and uncultured, only to be surprised when Ruth is as pale or as white as they are, Campbell demonstrated explicit awareness of Protestant America's racial ideas about Mormons. She even had Ruth laugh at Morris's surprise and say, "Why, did you expect to see some creature of a different type, a person with horns perhaps? How I wish I could introduce you to some of my friends. I believe you would change your mind." With this comment, Campbell took this fictional moment between two characters and generalized it to Latter-day Saints broadly. Just as the Greys were wrong to be suspicious of Ruth's looks and manners, her socially constructed whiteness, so too, Campbell implied, was America wrong to be suspicious of Mormon looks and manners of Ruth's friends. If properly acquainted with Latter-day Saints, Campbell implied, Americans would change their minds. By coding the American Latter-day Saint distance as misunderstanding and insisting on a common whiteness, Campbell's romance aimed for rapprochement with American race and society. Related to this, just as important as what Campbell brought up in her romance story is what she left out. Polygamy was the major lightning rod for anti-Mormon racialization, but Campbell's short story never brings up plural marriage, and moreover implicitly erases it. If we take the narrative setting to have been contemporary, 1901, and if we take seriously Ruth as a young adult, then Ruth would have been born well before the 1890 Manifesto, possibly even before the raid, around the time of the Udall's plural marriage. Yet somehow, with the death of her parents, Ruth has no living relations in all of the Intermountain West. This starkly contrasts with, for example, the life of Ella Stewart Udall. When her mother died, her mother's co-wife took Ella and her siblings in as her own. And during their wedding trip, Ida noted in her diary meeting Ella's numerous relatives, many tied together through polygamy. As other historians, including Amanda Hendrix-Komoto, have noted, polygamy forged kinship networks that interconnected Latter-day Saint society. For Ruth to exist completely outside these networks requires for her parents to not only have not been polygamists, but moreover to have been unrelated to any polygamists. In the story, Ruth's father is a convert, but her mother is from Utah. Could a girl Ruth's age really be left with no one? One could dismiss this as simply contrivance. In many ways, it is. Campbell simply needed to have Ruth move in with the Greys, or else there would be no story. Nevertheless, whether intended or not, the story as written carries and implies meaning to its readers. With polygamy unmentioned even by the initially anti-Mormon Greys, the contrivance of Ruth's non-polygamous family becomes an implication about Latter-day Saints. In the world of Morris Gray's savior, there is and implicitly never was any polygamy. Anti-Mormonism really is just misunderstanding then, as there is no discernible difference between Ruth and the Greys. Morris Gray's savior thus rewrote Latter-day Saint history to manifest a monogamous present, one where American and Mormon could mean one and the same. Udall's diary and Campbell's short story are, granted, simply two examples, two Latter-day Saints among thousands. Yet the profound difference between their deployments of romance tropes invites further investigation because the difference is not theirs alone. Rebecca de Schweinitz has noted how the Young Women's Journal published numerous stories with pro-polygamy love plots before Utah statehood, all of which dried up after incorporation into the Union. De Schweinitz reads these stories as pedagogy, but comparing their literary and affective articulation to Udall's own revision of the genre romance could be illuminating. Likewise, Campbell was not alone in rewriting the Latter-day Saint past through romance tropes. Non-Mormon Gilbert Patton also got in on the action with his 1897 romance story, Frank Merrill Meets the Mormons, which featured a romance subplot between Latter-day Saint supporting characters Tom Whitcomb and Lona Ayer. While Patton did not go as far as Campbell did by deleting polygamy from history, he did have Mormon characters assert that Joseph Smith was actually a monogamist, and polygamy was merely Brigham Young's distortion and on its way out among, quote, true Mormons, end quote. Patton's non-Mormon hero Frank Merrill even notes Latter-day Saints' racial acceptability, calling Tom a white man and all right, and Lona a peach with a good appearance. Campbell's and Patton's romance plots rewrite race, sex, and time, envisioning Latter-day Saints in line with the nation, just in time for them to participate in and collaborate with the acceleration of American imperialism on the continent and overseas. This is only the tip of an iceberg that could bear further investigation. Stephen Taysom's fine study of the construction of Latter-day Saint memory about polygamy glides over the crucial years of 1890 and 1904. Are there other romances or fictions from that time, like Campbell's and Patton's, that might suggest how memory was reconstructed in those years? Finally, that both Udall and Campbell wrote in the same genre with such different results reminds us of romance's capaciousness. As Catherine Roach posits, the genre is conservative in its message of happily ever after pair bonding, yet also radical in its potential. As Eric Jepson suggested in Thursday's Genre Roundtable, adding Latter-day Saint elements is one way to stretch genres, as Udall did with romance. Even Patton, in his depiction of Americanized Mormons, cannot quite resist the creative pull of his own subject matter. In the closing scene, a mentor character tells Lona to be a good wife to Tom, for he has risked his very life for thee, then adds, indicating Frank Merriwell and his friend, quote, and these other young men have risked no less. Reading implication into this comment, Lona replies, quote, but I cannot marry them all. Patton plays this as a joke, but how remarkable that the romance subplot threatened by the idea of rapacious polygyny closes with this gesture to the possibility of polyandry. In the end, everything is a story, and for these turn-of-the-century Latter-day Saints, genre romance was a particularly useful form of foretelling, untelling, and retelling their stories. Thank you.
Thanks, Makoto. That was fascinating. Well, we'll now turn to a little bit later in Mormon history, but not too much later, and Stephen Carter is up.
That was a fascinating presentation and very appropriate to what's coming up next, because Virginia Sorensen's novels have magnificent romantic elements to them. You should totally go read them. So I don't think I've met any return missionary that doesn't have dreams about being back on their mission. Usually it's not about being on their first mission, but about being on their second or even their third mission. And the thing about these dreams is that they're never peaceful dreams. They're always charged, whether the dreamer feels excited to be back at the work or, as is often the case with me, wondering what in the world motivated me to go out on another mission. I often wonder what these dreams mean. They don't seem to be like a stress dream. They seem to involve a lot more than that. And I sometimes think it's the younger, more orthodox and older, more heterodox versions of me trying to communicate with each other. So as I was reading Virginia Sorensen's novels to prepare to write her biography, I noticed something very similar in 3 of her books. In On the Star, The Evening and the Morning, and Many Heavens, a character is returning to the small Mormon town that they grew up in. And I started wondering if these, just lost my place, if these novels were Virginia's version of mission dreams. But instead of returning to her mission, which she never served, she returns to Manti, where she spent her formative years and where she was deeply involved with her LDS ward. So I became further intrigued when I realized that each return has a very different outcome and that they seem to follow an arc. So the connections were strong enough that I started thinking of these 3 books as a trilogy and as Virginia's microgenre, which I have called The Returning Mormon. So at the moment, I'm sad to say, none of these books are easily found. They're all way out of print and haven't found their way to ebook format, though Signature has assured me that The Evening and the Morning will be available soon. So, spoiler alert, I'm going to give you a quick rundown of the plots and give away parts of their endings, though not all of them. So don't worry too much about it, because there are abundant pleasures in reading Virginia's works that don't rely on the ending. So On This Star, oh, I forgot to turn off my background blur. Let's see if I can make this work. On This Star, oh, that worked very, very well. All right, so On This Star, it's set in Templeton, Utah, which is based on Manti, Utah, with Chelnesia Bowen, Chel for short, a beautiful early 20s Mormon a few weeks away from marrying a second-generation Danish man, Jens Eriksson. But her fiance has a half-brother, Eric, the son of his father's polygamous wife. Eric has returned to Templeton for the summer from the East, where he performs as a pianist and organist. And he's offered to give Chel, who also plays, lessons as a wedding gift. So this sets the stage for them to fall in love. But they aren't just falling for each other. they're falling for what the other represents. So at first, this convergence between them is wildly productive. Chell sees exciting new possibilities opening up with Eric, with music, and with the larger world, which he has never experienced. Meanwhile, Eric feels his sense of the sacred emerging again through Chell and starts to integrate his music with his Mormonism. So Chell comes alive to her body, Eric comes alive to his soul. And they plan to run off together, but the patterns that each are tied to are too polarizing to coexist. But their need for each other is so strong that when their relationship breaks up, they break as well. Chell stays in Templeton and enters a loveless marriage with Jens, and Eric makes a marginal living from his performances back east. And when he returns, he and Jens are involved in a hunting accident that kills Jens, and then there's even another ending after that. But that's the important part for this. So the evening and the morning follows Kate Alexander, a 50-something woman who was returned to the small Mormon town that she spent much of her life in order to collect information that would get her government pension. But she left the town decades earlier under a cloud because she had carried on a secret affair with a neighbor, Peter, with whom she had a child, though the child was imputed to her husband at the time. Only her sister-in-law knows about this affair, and it is she who ejects Kate from her home. So Kate leaves town, leaving her daughter that she conceived with Peter to be raised by a relation. So then Kate returns many years later. Her daughter is grown with a family of her own, but she's ill at ease in the Mormon town. Kate finds out that Peter's wife has died, and she wonders if she can finally be together with him. So all a hope, she seeks him out. But at the end of the novel, when Kate arrives at Peter's home, he dutifully offers to reconnect, but she hears in his words, quote, "the terrible burden of obligation," unquote. So the man she loves is gone. Quote, how much of him had she created for herself, she wondered, in order to love him perfectly, unquote. And now, Many Heavens, you will be especially interested in this one, Komoto. Many Heavens begins a few years after the Woodruff Manifesto in a town based on Cache Valley. Zina, the protagonist, a girl just coming of age, is hired by Nils to be a caretaker for his wife, Medi, who was crippled in an accident soon after their marriage. So Nils trained in medicine in Europe after his mission and then returned to marry Medi, and Zina's parochial eyes are opened by the worldly and scientific text that Nils reads aloud to Medi while Zina is there. And a hunger for knowledge starts to awaken inside of Zina, along with a hunger for Nils. So as Nils started, and Nils starts falling in love with Zina, emotionally, intellectually, and physically. So watching their romance unfold is one of the great pleasures of Many Heavens. But a single line looms over them. Quote, "One woman never in this world walked to happiness over the body of another," unquote. So, though Sorensen takes readers deeply into the flourishing intimacy between Zina and Nils, she never lets them forget that Medi's heart is of equal value. But the Woodruff Manifesto stops the story from getting off too easily, simply making a community-sanctioned polygynous marriage. But would that have really resolved the issue? A marriage would have happened, but what about the hearts involved? At the end of the book, spoiler alert, Zina accepts a scholarship at an Eastern school to pursue her own medical degree in order to remove herself from this situation. But Medi stops her and offers her a place in the family. Quote, this is what Medi says, quote, "Nils loves you very much," Medi said, "and if she winced, I didn't see it. I've known for a long time, but I've known still longer that he loves me for different things in different ways. Why should all of us go on suffering so much?" Unquote. So, in On This Star, Sorensen seems to return to Mormonism with Eric, exploring the possibilities of the Mormon pattern meeting worldly patterns. But in the end, she admits that she can only see it ending in destruction. In the evening and the morning, Virginia returns with Kate Alexander and seems to be able to make her way a little more deeply into Mormon culture, and even has hopes that it will work out. But in the end, Kate and Virginia still find themselves unable to reintegrate. But in Many Heavens, Sorensen's returning Mormon character finally succeeds. Like Eric Erickson and Kate Alexander before him, Niels leaves the community and journeys into the capitals of culture and returns. But instead of finding death or rejection, he integrates his new self with the people he sprang from, even to the point of taking on one of their most peculiar practices and transforming it into a relationship where the heart, rather than the institution, is the most important. So how did Virginia get to this point where a returning character could finally integrate? My theory is that it was her writing of The Proper Gods, which she published after The Evening and the Morning and before Many Heavens. I do have it, but I forgot to bring it with me. Sorry. So The Proper Gods is a story about Aiden, a young Yaqui man recently discharged from the US Army and traveling to Patam, Mexico, his ancestral village. Now, this seems a familiar beginning, right? As Sorensen characters are often returning to their homelands, but there's a twist. Aiden grew up in exile in Pascua, which is an Arizona village, and his family relocated to Patam while he was away in the army. So instead of returning to the community he inhabited in his youth, where he could interact intuitively, he enters a culture mostly unknown to him. And the culture, of course, is unknown to Virginia as well. She spent years researching the Yaqui culture, as well as some months living with them. She also worked with Ned and Roz Spicer, who were anthropologists who specialized in the Yaqui. And the Yaqui are a significantly different culture than small-town Mormonism and American culture generally. It's quite an experience to come out the other side of The Proper Gods. Every page has been work. Every paragraph and sometimes every sentence has presented a new piece of an alien matrix, alien to us, to middle class, white, etc., that seems to have almost no reference to a Western worldview. So if readers can go the entire distance with The Proper Gods, being forced to see everything with beginner's eyes, they begin to realize that the purpose of the book isn't to help them understand the Yaqui culture. Rather, it is to feel what it is like to see the world anew. As Virginia said, quote, "It's not new insights that are important in writing, but new seeing," unquote. So researching and writing The Proper Gods seems to have been a kind of baptism for Sorensen herself. It marks the first time that one of her characters returns to their community and integrates with it. I think that, whether consciously or not, Sorensen wrote this novel as a way of releasing herself and her readers from our own point of view, from the invisible programming that we judge life by. She baptized her readers, herself by immersion into this very un-Western culture at enough length and in enough detail that they could finally intuit two essential things. One, the Yaqui's culture has an undeniable validity. And two, the reader has a complete lack of authority to judge it. So characters in Virginia's Mormon novels previous to The Proper Gods return, but either find tragedy or disappointment. And it's true that Eric and Kate, and probably Sorensen herself, are subtly or not so subtly judging the culture from which they came. The Proper Gods taught Sorensen how to feel a culture's full credence and find ways of creating within its confines. She brought that lesson with her to Many Heavens, which features a returning character who not only integrates with the community, but integrates his outside experiences and worldviews with even its fundamentalist aspects. And a few years later, I think Sorensen took matters a step further when she published Kingdom Come. Ta-da! A novel about 19th century Danes who joined the LDS Church, which some reviewers commented could almost have been published by the church itself. So she'd learned how to let Mormonism be Mormonism. She could heft it without feeling that she had to judge it. She sank fully into the stories and characters without an outside consciousness hovering in judgment. And I think that it's Kingdom Come that gives her other Mormon novels their full weight, because it's the first act for every previous Mormon novel Virginia had written. All of them were very much in the vein of the second and third acts, filled with messy characters whose thrilling youthful beginnings had run into diverse paths, becoming ever more individual, complicated, and intimate. And these novels certainly stand on their own. But Kingdom Come can give them even more weight because it reminds its readers of the compelling vision that these characters, this religion, and this culture sprang from. People were, in fact, willing to sacrifice all they had to follow this new gospel into a strange land. They really did build a kingdom in the desert. Without that story at the foundation of Sorensen's novels, either haunting them or supporting them, they can't be fully understood and valued. So Kingdom Come, to me, is the first movement in the symphony Sorensen had been building, book by book, for 18 years. And we owe it to Virginia's willingness to deeply experience a culture almost entirely different from her own. Though, as she noted, quote, "I found a much more important commonness beneath the uncommonness. Even their history, when I studied it carefully afterward, had its similarity to our own. Joseph Smith or Robert E. Lee, or the great Yaqui hero Kaheme. How different, and yet how much alike they are. I remember my first shock at the echo in the words and the idea when a Yaqui said to me proudly, 'We are a peculiar people.' Asking questions of these strangers taught me what questions to ask myself and what questions to ask of life. Period."
Thanks, Stephen. That was fascinating, and I can only hope that we will get to see at least some of Virginia and Sorensen's work back into people's hands in a little bit more easy way. We'll come back to some of these themes, but first we need to hear from Amanda. So you're now up.
Thank you so much. I actually read Virginia Sorensen's Many Heavens maybe 2 weeks ago.
Really?
Yeah, I was trying to get a sense of Mormon literature. I must say, the most shocking thing about it is actually the illegitimate birth. And she's one of the few people I know from that time period who explores what last couple of years, I've been researching Ina Coolbrith, Joseph Smith's niece, who's also the first poet laureate of California. And one of the things that I try to do as a historian rather than as a literary scholar is understand what her work can tell us about how she understands herself in relationship to the Mormon religious tradition, what her life and work tells us about how women were thinking about nature, family, domesticity. And then I'm also interested in how she relates to California as a place. And I'm going to be exploring some of these themes today. But what I want to do before, and this is partially me as a historian, before I start discussing the content of her poetry, is talk a little bit about her life and who she was. So on March 10th, 1841, Agnes Coolbrith gave birth to a daughter. She called her Josephine Donna, Josephine after Joseph Smith, the child's uncle, and then Donna after her father, Don Carlos. But the family nicknamed her Ina. Ina had been born into a world that industrialization was in the process of transforming. At the time, wage labor seemed to promise American women independence that had hitherto seemed impossible, while the invention of new machines made work more efficient and impersonal. In terms of religion, the revelations of her uncle Joseph Smith thrilled those who called themselves Latter-day Saints. Agnes believed that her daughter would be raised in an American Zion and would have the opportunity to hear the words of God from the lips of prophets and even angels. It was not, however, to be. A few months after Ina's birth, her father, Don Carlos, died from pneumonia, and 3 years later, a group of men assassinated her uncles, Joseph and Hiram Smith. Her mother, Agnes, decided not to follow the Saints to Utah. Instead, the family settled in Los Angeles before eventually moving to San Francisco. As a young woman, Ina became an important part of California's emerging literary elite. Important California writers like Bret Harte, Charles Warren Stoddard, and Joaquin Miller considered her a close friend. The conservationist John Muir served as a pallbearer at her mother's funeral, and a young Jack London credited her with inspiring his love of literature. Together, these writers worked together to create a distinctive California literary culture that would create the region and state as a progressive, vigorous place that would soon surpass the American East and Europe in its achievements. I, however, first encountered Ina in the letters that she wrote to her cousin, Joseph F. Smith. Initially, Ina's family clung to the church that had emerged from her uncle's encounters with the divine. By the time that Joseph F. visited his aunt and cousins on the way to his mission in California or in Hawaii, however, Ina had begun to question the prophetic authority of Brigham Young and the practice of polygamy itself. For her part, she explicitly rejected the idea of gathering. She told her cousin that she was, quote, not lost living in California, and quote, ultimately, she believed that she could worship God in California or in Utah. Ina had also begun to hear rumors about Utah's embrace of polygamy and considered the practice to be no better than the creation of, quote, harems. The niece of Joseph Smith quoted the Book of Mormon to convince her cousin that he was wrong. She said, quote, take your Book of Mormon and read it carefully, Joe, before reminding him that God had condemned Zeniff's son Noah for keeping, quote, wives and concubines, end quote. And one of the things so I hate Joseph F. Smith. I think he's a horrible person who's sort of abusive to his wives in his letters to them. And so it was really nice for once to see someone take Joseph F. Smith to task and basically tell him that he didn't know what he was talking about. And she is one of the few people within the family who writes to him in that way and sort of considers herself to be just as smart and just as deserving of reading and interpreting the Book of Mormon as Joseph F. And she reminds him that Joseph Smith's blood flows through her blood or her veins as well. And he's not the only one who has prophetic blood running through their veins. In the longer book that I'm planning on Ina's life, I explore her relationship to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and her rejection of the family as an institution. She is married at one point and then her only child dies. It's unclear exactly how the child dies, but afterwards, she refuses to marry again and instead decides that she is going to live independently and work to support her family. Her stepfather was an alcoholic. He struggles throughout her life to maintain a steady income. And so it's Ina's work as a poet, librarian, and tutor that provides a home for her mother and stepfather. And then after her sister's death, her nieces and nephews, and then Joaquin Miller at one point decides to abandon one of his children on her doorstep. And so Ina cares for them as well. I think like a lot of people who have been placed in that situation, Ina resents the burden that her family has placed upon her. She struggles to find time to write and laments that the constant grind of work, of working at a library for 10, 12 hours a day, cataloging, helping people find books, prevents her from reaching her full potential as a poet. And I think her life is important for understanding sort of her ideas about not only domesticity and the family, but also about women's relationship to poetry, to nature, to work itself. And now that I've given you a little bit about her life, I want to spend the rest of my time today on the thing that she loved the most, her poetry, and the thing that she wished that she had had more time to fully develop. And that the failure of so many men in her life had not taken away from her. Like many female poets in the 19th century, Ina often wrote about flowers and nature. I argue in this paper that her nature poetry reveals Ina's continuing connection to the Mormon tradition, even after she was no longer a member of the church and could not be considered a saint. In 1895, the Popular Bookstore of San Francisco, and that's actually its name, the Popular Bookstore, that's not just reflective of its popularity. The Popular Bookstore of San Francisco published a thin volume of her poetry celebrating California's wildfires. The editor, or a thin volume of poetry, the editor convinced Ina to contribute a verse. Pressed between the book's pages are century-old flowers. And I don't have it here. I'm actually in California rather than Montana. But there's actually wildflowers pressed into the pages. And so each copy has different wildflowers that have been picked. The yellow petals of the California poppy that appear on Ina's page are almost translucent, at least on my copy, but you can still see the filaments that sprouted from its center and helped to produce pollen. Grace Hibbard describes the poppy on the following page as, quote, golden cups with jewels of raindrops and dew, end quote. Ina describes a deep yellow, almost orange flower that has been pressed on her page as, quote, a fragile fairy thing, a jeweled moth, a butterfly with rare and tender tints upon his brown downy wing, end quote. Her poem plays with the flower's name. The mariposa, or butterfly lily, forever lies with its petals carefully arranged to give the impression of an insect taking flight. Its stem is adorned with what might be, and I tried to find this out online, but my plant knowledge is very, very low. It looks to me to be sprigs of baby's breath, but if anybody ever comes to my house and sees it and tells me differently, I will offer no talk back. The imagery that both Hibbard and Ina Coolbrith are drawing on is ubiquitous in the 18th and 19th centuries. Women had participated fully in the emerging field of botany. According to one historian, women collected plants, drew them, studied them, and named them, taught their children about plants, and wrote popularizing books on botany. Botany as a science in the 18th and early 19th centuries is considered, quote, feminine. By the mid-19th century, however, women's engagement with plants had changed. Men overtake the science of botany and dismiss the writings of women about flowers and nature as fanciful and unserious. This development, as Ina and Grace Hibbard both show, did not stop women writing about flowers. Instead, they turned to writing about flowers and nature in poetry as a way to play with expectations for their sex, muse about the nature of God, reveal their erotic desires, and express knowledge about the natural world. In this tradition, Ina sometimes uses flowers to talk about the bitterness she feels after being abandoned by her husband and the burdens that men have forced upon her. The summer rose is dead, she writes in one poem. Dry grasses mat the plain. The flowers, if they still exist in this poem, are desiccated. They are no longer the fragile fairy things that she'd written about in an earlier poem, but they become death and winter. And the cold allows her to talk about the pain that she feels. And in the 19th century, this sort of nature poetry where nature is being used to talk about feeling becomes associated with women and becomes sort of associated as a feminine art. In another poem, she uses images from the natural world to talk about the emotion she felt at the birth and death of her only child. Initially, the imagery that she uses seems to represent joy. So far, the sun rose yesterday morn, she writes. The mountain cliffs adorning, the golden tassels of the corn danced in the breath of morning. In the poem, Ina watches her, quote, pretty babe playing in a sunbeam, end quote. She laughs as the child tries to grasp the shining treasure in vain. After the child's death, however, a single ray of sunlight coming through the window is enough to make her, quote, weep. In this poem called A Mother's Grief, nature represents life, and the absence of nature and the absence of flowers, death. Ina never delves deeply into theology in her poetry, nor does she describe her relationship to the Mormon tradition. After the Mountain Meadows massacre, there was quite a lot of violence against Latter-day Saints living in California. And it's around that time that Ina actually stops going by Josephine Donna and starts hiding her relationship to Mormonism. And after that time period, she never really talks or openly identifies as Mormon. And in fact, it's only after her death that she's identified as Mormon within the United States. It does appear that she lost her faith at some point. We don't know exactly when, but it's also quite clear that she felt that she was not safe to identify as Mormon outside of Utah and in California as a whole. In her poetry, however, she does place an emphasis on the physical world that mirrors Mormon understandings of the divine, although she never quite gets to the idea of an embodied God. And her emphasis on the importance of the physical world is on contrast to the way that a lot of white Protestants saw the physical body. For white Protestants, the soul is trapped within the body, and death becomes a release of the soul in which the soul is freed from the heaviness of the physical world. In her poetry, however, Ina describes individuals as being drawn towards life because of the beauty of the physical world. She describes at one point humanity as, quote, God's incarnate thought. After death, however, individuals do not joyfully escape their bodies. Instead, they find themselves yearning for the physical world. She describes Earth as, quote, mother arms, end quote, that hold individuals when they are children, and imagines the departed turning towards the earth to gaze upon, quote, her dear face, end quote. And she describes the relationship between humans and Mother Earth as one of love, and says that there is an inability, or that people can't actually place a barrier between that sort of love, and that even after death, people continue to have a relationship with nature and the earth itself. And so Ina, even though she never fully adopts the Mormon belief that God is an embodied being, or that humans are going to exult in having a physical body after their resurrection, she develops this very close association with the natural world, with life, that a lot of Protestants would have been deeply uncomfortable with. And indeed, there are times in her poetry when she seems to reject the idea that there's an afterlife altogether. And in those particular poems, it's the absence of nature, the absence of flowers, that seems to mark the sadness of death. And so in her poem Oblivion, she imagines herself dead, being placed, quote, beneath the rooted flowers, where winter rain nor showers of April fall, end quote. She then imagines death as a, quote, sleep that begets not dreams, and tells her reader that there is, quote, no voice of streams nor voice of trees. In this imagining of death, the nightingales are unable to sing, and it's just basically an image of darkness that envelops the world. She tells her readers that many of the dwellers are in this realm. And in this particular poem, unlike some of her other poems, there is no resurrection, and nothing sort of disrupts this emptiness. Quote, no eyelids are stirred by the touch of tears, and the poet's brain is no longer stirred by the rapture and the pain of song. End quote. Instead, the dead are, quote, laid in armor down to mold, end quote. And she feels that they were, quote, evermore lie as earth and time forget them. In many of her poems, Ina uses the natural world to describe the interior state. And then in this way, her poetry is part of a wider 19th century literary tradition. The role that women had played in botany and sentimental ideas about the language of flowers, where you have a flower representing a specific emotion, encouraged female poets and writers to use images drawn from nature to describe their emotion. Ina also, however, uses nature poetry to create California as a literary space and to claim it as part of a European literary tradition. In the 19th century, white settlers frequently renamed what had been indigenous landscapes. And Ina does this in her own poetry. She never refers to sort of local indigenous traditions, and instead she attempts to attach California to Greece, Britain, France as a way to sort of elevate it to a similar status. So in her poem, California, she personifies California as a woman, describing her as earthy and brown, quote, tawny of limb with dusts of forest in her hair. Ina uses this imagery afterwards to suggest that California had been waiting for white settlement for centuries. As she waits, California, the woman, can hear, quote, only silence stirred sometimes by wind and leaf and by the clash of grassy spears. The image that Ina is creating draws explicitly on settler colonialism. White settlers depicted the Americas as a wilderness empty of people to justify their seizure of land. After describing her solitude, the personified California invites the reader to imagine, quote, the savage tongue of my brown savage children who dance round the wigwam fires and chant wild songs. And despite the thousands of people that she is describing here, creating families, cultivating fields, and molding their own cultural traditions, Ina paints California as seeing herself as absolutely alone in solitude. She describes it as aloneness, as silence. California, the personified being here, never engages with Native Americans, choosing instead to hold herself apart. In the end, California's solitude is only broken when a white poet arrives on her shores. And Ina muses that her blossoms only yield their secrets to him, to this white poet. In later years, Ina published dozens of poems about specific places in California. And this sort of continues the process of naming California as a white space. She, in a 1906 poem written after the San Francisco fire, describes San Francisco as, quote, barren hills against the skies, topped with a minaret and spire. Later on, in a poem that's sort of on the next page, she describes the ocean on the day of the San Francisco fire as a, quote, huge, hungry beast ready to tear and crush and mangle and destroy its prey, end quote. And in some ways, these are really powerful poems about destruction, but it continues that attempt to sort of claim space by writing poetry, by naming things, by incorporating it into this emerging California tradition. She describes the Golden Gate Bridge as, quote, a rose shot purple on sunset hills and skies of golden fire, end quote, and the Santa Clara Valley as, quote, a green pasture slopes with dotting trees, end quote. In describing these places, Ina often draws on Greek mythology and culture to describe California. Mount Shasta snows are described as crowning the peaks with as much splendor as that graced Pericles, and Alcatraz becomes the Viking of the seas. In her anniversary poem for California, it's London's bells that she describes pealing in recognition of the state's literary achievements. And in many ways, Ina is drawing on what she knows to describe places, but this is very much part of a larger attempt to claim spaces by renaming them. The earliest maps of Virginia actually use indigenous place names to describe the area. And within a couple of years, when they draw new maps, they've replaced those with European names. And so I find it interesting that Ina never refers to any sort of indigenous people by name. She never talks about any local traditions. It's always about California and the American West waiting for white poets invariably to come and raise them to the same status as these other personified images of Greece and Rome and Britain and France. I'm going to skip ahead real quick because I have 1 minute left. And in some ways, I actually see this as deeply Mormon, or at least as akin to what Latter-day Saints are doing. Ina enters California with James Beckworth, who's a famous Indian scout, African-American actually. And in her memoir, and who knows if this is true, she claims that as they were passing through the Sierra Nevadas, he actually leaned down to her, told her that she was the first white child to pass through this path, and then whispers to her, "This is California, little girl, here is your kingdom." And this sort of is a very similar image to an also historically contested image of Brigham Young looking over the Salt Lake Valley and saying, "This is your place." And one question might be, is this a Mormon sort of claiming and creation of kingdoms? Is this part of a larger Western imagery? And why do we see those sort of similar images? Ina Coolbrith ultimately died on February 29th, 1928. The San Francisco Chronicle calls her a link, the last we had, with California's earliest and most brilliant literary period. And she comes to stand in for this early emergence of a California literature. The article, however, would be her only tombstone. Ina's grave is actually unmarked until 1986, when a group of people fundraises to put a tombstone on her graves. And so in the end, she is surrounded only by the trees and flowers about which she had imagined and imagined them covering her grave. And I will go ahead and stop there.
Thanks, Amanda. That was, I knew a bit about Ina and her poetry, and having lived in California, especially for a while, and then later getting involved in Mormon literature, kind of getting these kind of glimpses from two different sides of her. I think your presentation has led me to my first question, and so I'm hoping my other panelists are up for this. And which is, I want to ask about how embodiment, because that's a theme that's been coming up quite a bit in our sessions during this conference, and or landscape relate to the subjects of your presentations, Makoto and Stephen. And we'll start with Makoto. Is that, and specifically, or if not the subjects of your presentations, kind of other Mormon narratives that you're aware of from this time period, the late 19th and early 20th century. So we'll start with Makoto, then go to Stephen, and then see if Amanda has any responses to that.
Certainly. Thanks both for your presentations. Those were amazing. You're right, Stephen. I am looking for many heavens in the library, like right after this. And thanks to Amanda for bringing embodiment really into our panel. I actually, when I had that line about, all of our bodies are the product of intimate encounters, and that's why romance is so relatable, I rewrote that to bring in bodies, because I was like, oh dang, I got to get on this. I got to get on the right wavelength with everybody. But seeing that question though is a good one, and makes me think about other elements from Ida's diary, for instance, that I didn't bring up. There is this interesting way in which, on her wedding night diary entry, for instance, earlier, sort of before getting to the part where she talks with Ella, she describes this interaction with David, and they don't do anything. It seems, right, like he just goes to sleep and she stays up and talks with Ella. But she mentions that she narrates specifically that David whispers the sacred name of wife into my ear, and my heart fluttered with a strange new happiness. Right? So she does. I don't know if I'd say that's uniquely Latter-day Saint, right? But that's the idea of sort of communicating and describing her emotions through her body, right? The feeling of hearing those words on her ear, the feeling of her heart. I'd have to become more familiar with the wider sentimental romance genre to sort of to discern whether that's language also used by folks like Holmes, or whether that's kind of coming from someplace. So that's a good question, and I'm going to keep thinking about that, because that's really good.
Awesome. Stephen, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, actually, one of the things that really surprises a lot of people when they read Virginia Sorensen's novels, I mean, she was publishing during the 40s and 50s and the early part of the 60s, her Mormon novels. When they go back and read them, they're kind of surprised by how much eroticism is in there. There are a lot of bodies in her books, and they are attracted to each other. And that is really important to her. And one of the main pleasures of reading her novels is how she brings the body and the spirit together, and sees how they interact with each other. So, for example, in On This Star, Chell is experiencing her body for the first time. She had not felt it, even when Jens was, giving her a hug or doing things. But Eric, which interestingly enough, he's the smaller one of the two. Jens is this big, burly, sort of Thor-like man, and Eric is a smaller sort of artistic type. But it's him that gets her going, partially through his music. And music is a physical thing; it's sound waves, and it comes into her, and she can send them out. Oh, reading Virginia Sorensen is something else. And then in the evening and in the morning, a 50-something woman comes back, and as she breathes in the valley, and as she talks with the people, and as she remembers, she starts remembering her time with, forgot his name, Peter. Her body starts responding. Her body starts remembering, and you get to hear and read all of these things. She may have been writing it in the 50s, but she was well ahead of her time in this particular aspect of novel writing. And then, you remember what it's like to see that tension-filled romance coming up between Niels and Zina. I mean, oh my gosh, it's kind of amazing. So that's one of the main reasons to read Virginia, is to feel bodies coming in to Mormon discourse and Mormon literature, because most of the time it's like, oh, keep those bodies away from each other, keep those Book of Mormons between you. But she's the one who brings it all together.
Thanks, Stephen. I actually have two things for Amanda. The first is, do you have any kind of responses to the other two panelists' papers and what they've said so far? But then the second thing is if you could just give a little bit of more detail about the book you're writing about Ina, kind of who's gonna be publishing it, kind of some general thoughts about it. People in the chat were curious about this book.
Yeah, well, as far as embodiment and what Makoto and Stephen has said, I think one question that I would ask us to be a little bit more specific about when embodiment comes up. And Stephen talked a little bit about this. I think one of the things I've noticed, not just in Mormon literature, but literature in general, is we talk about people being embodied in relation to landscape and where they live. And a little bit in romance novels, although perhaps not in the ones that Makoto is reading, you'll get really thick descriptions of sex, right? Like that's why people, at least my mother, I think, although she'll deny it, reads romance novels. But there's always euphemisms involved. And it's more invent to like give you a little bit of a thrill than actually talking about what it means to be an embodied person. And I've seen many fewer descriptions of midwifery that are embodied. Usually the baby just sort of appears, right? And so I would be interested, and I have no answers to this, about when writers feel comfortable talking about the actual experience of being embodied and when they just kind of fade to black. And then as far as the book, it's going to be with Matt Bowman's series and Joe Spencer's series on Mormon thought with the University of Illinois. So it'll be quite short. And right now, the introductory chapter, which has to be a biography, they've set out the parameters of what each book has to look like. And they very much are quite structured. And then there'll be 3 chapters, one probably actually on how she thinks about the Smith family. She talks about it as a prophetic tradition and initially sees her poetry as a form of, I wouldn't say quite prophecy, but that she is a poet because of the prophetic blood coming through her veins. And then I'll have a chapter on the nature poetry. And then the last chapter is up for debate. We'll see what ends up sort of calling my name the most for that one. I have a couple of ideas, but it's constantly sort of shifting on what it is. And who knows? I mean, I would say maybe 18 months to 2 years on when that comes out.
Awesome. A bunch of us are very much looking forward to it. Just real quick on the on that notion of embodiment and depiction in fiction and literature, and also specifically in Mormon literature. One work that comes to mind for me is actually Rosalind Eve's YA novel Beyond the Map Stars, which was published nationally and has some features a young Mormon woman as a protagonist, and there is a lot of ways that she discusses her relationship in relation to the various landscapes that she travels to, in relationship to other people and their bodies, and including a somewhat harrowing birthing scene, midwife scene. Trying to think of, I have a couple other things that I'm thinking about, but let me just choose one. Can we talk about California and Utah? Because all of us, I don't know about Stephen specifically, I think perhaps a little bit, but there is in all of our both personal backgrounds, and I'm including myself in this, but also in some of the works that we have either written or studied and histories we've looked at, there is always this thing of I don't know how to explain it, but California Mormons and the Utah Mormon experience and the Utah landscape and the California landscape. And I don't mean just in the kind of the colloquial church thing of, well, there's California Mormons and the Utah Mormons. I mean something a little bit more historically rooted and interesting than that. But there's just a thought that came to mind as I was listening to everybody talk about of Stephen with the Virginia Sorensen's protagonists who leave and then come back and that sort of thing. So anybody have anything to say about my rambling?
One thing that I learned when I was researching my biography of Virginia is that she has an unpublished novel that she worked her butt off on about Sam Brannan, who was the guy who Brigham Young called to sail with a group of Mormons around the entire, South America and end up in San Bernardino. And then when he got there, he's like, let's stay here. Brigham Young was like, no. And so he said, all right, I'll stay here then. And he was quite a character. Like, he did a lot of things. So she did quite a bit of study about California and Sam Brannan stuff there. And she tried to get this novel published, and it went through harrowing revisions through Knopf, and they finally rejected it, and she never got it published. So the only way to read it, if you need another Virginia Sorensen novel to read, is to go into Newell Bringhurst's papers in the University of Utah archive, where you can read photocopies. But beware, one of the things that her editor said is, the first quarter is written in blood and fire, and the last quarter is written in blood and fire, but the middle is written in molasses.
Oh dear. Well, yes. Yeah, go ahead, Emma.
Well, I guess I could comment maybe a bit. I think one of the things that California Mormons are dealing with, at least initially, is although both California and Utah are part of Mexico, right? When Mormons arrive in the Great Basin, the California Mormons, just because of their small numerically, are much more cognizant of Spanish or Mexican culture and have to adapt to it. Whereas in Utah, they ignore its presence. And so I think, that's one of the reasons, right, for the differences even in the 20th century between California and Utah and their Mormon populations is one is the majority and can impose its will on others, and the other can't and has to adapt. And I'd actually be curious for Makoto, are the Udalls in Arizona?
Yes, the Udalls are in Arizona.
Yeah.
Sorry, were you going to continue? Or?
Oh, I was just going to ask sort of how Arizona is affecting sort of the romance novel and the diary that you were looking at and the way that space works.
I'm not 100% sure how it affects the romance portion of the diary, but it definitely influences the diary. Thank you for pointing this out, because I thought I only had trivia. Ida actually spends the first few years of her life in San Bernardino. Her parents end up there. Her grandma, Louisa Barnes Pratt, sort of comes out there, and the way the family history is told, that she kind of like gets them back on board with the church and drags them back to Utah. And Ida's fond childhood memories are formed in Beaver, Utah. Moving to Snowflake is actually rather a disruption when she does it in her teenage years. The way Arizona sort of plays into the diary, is you get another sort of look at these dynamics of like white American colonization. Ida is, I quite admire Ida, but she is not enlightened on this stuff. She is drinking the Kool-Aid, because she ends up living in St. John's with the Udalls. So, and that is not a Latter-day Saint founded town. That was founded by largely Hispanic settlers and with some Jewish folks. And so there's a lot of Mexican Catholics who live there. And there ends up being this tension between the Latter-day Saints and who are mostly Euro-American and their Mexican Catholic neighbors. So it's a religious conflict. It gets turned into a racial conflict. What comes up to the top of my mind is that Ida mentioned sort of living surrounded by Mexican families. And there's this moment where in her diary where Ella is giving birth. And so Ida mentions how she has to run so far to find a neighbor to help out. And Genevieve Long is actually the one who points this out in her dissertation. And Long is like, Ida doesn't consider like Ida told us that she lives surrounded by families, and like none of them apparently can help. Like she doesn't look to them. She doesn't, she resorts to white Latter-day Saints as her neighbors. So that's at least one example, and you can kind of read the diary as part of this sort of creating domesticity and sort of bringing in this white Christian sensibility.
Thanks, Makoto, and thanks for asking that question, Amanda. Well, we are at our time, but I hope that anyone who sees this is inspired to go seek out the work by these three female Mormon figures that have been discussed. Thanks again to our panelists. We'll see you all at 2:30, where Stephen Carter will be back to talk with Angela Hallstrom about his writing career and his work in Mormon letters. Thanks, everybody.